Think your wedding day was stressful? You have no idea what real wedding pressure looks like. In 12th century England, getting married wasn't just about saying yes to the dress and hoping your relatives behaved themselves. It was about surviving a public spectacle that would make modern reality television producers blush with envy. Picture this. You're a young bride, maybe 14 years old if you're lucky, standing in front of not just your family and friends, but half the village. Everyone's watching, everyone's judging, and everyone's about to follow you into your bedroom to make sure you actually go through with consummating your marriage. No pressure, right? Welcome to medieval England, where privacy was a luxury nobody could afford, and wedding nights were community events. The bedding ceremony wasn't some quaint tradition your great-aunt mentions at family gatherings. This was serious business. We're talking about a ritual so important that it could make or break political alliances, determine inheritance rights, and decide whether your marriage was even legally valid. Mess this up, and you weren't just embarrassing yourself in front of cousin Margaret. You were potentially destroying carefully negotiated treaties between powerful families. But here's where it gets really interesting. What happened when a bride couldn't handle the pressure? What occurred when the stress of having dozens of people escort you to your marriage bed, undress you, and then sit around making jokes while you're supposed to perform your wifely duties became too much to bear? One particular incident in 12th century England shows us exactly how brutal this system could be for the women trapped within it. Medieval weddings were nothing like the romantic ceremonies we know today. Forget walking down the aisle to your beloved while your friends cry tears of joy. These were business transactions disguised as celebrations. The bride and groom often met for the first time on their wedding day, having been promised to each other by their parents when they were still children. Love wasn't just not required, it was considered irrelevant. The entire process revolved around one crucial concept: the dowry. This wasn't a gift from loving parents to help the happy couple start their new life together. The dowry was the bride's inheritance, handed over to the groom's family as payment for taking her off her parents' hands. Think of it as medieval Venmo, except instead of splitting dinner costs, you're literally buying a wife. These financial arrangements were negotiated with the same intensity as modern corporate mergers. Families would spend months hammering out the details of what land, goods, and cash would change hands. The bride herself was essentially a walking contract, and her wedding day was the signing ceremony. No wonder the stress levels were through the roof. The church had only recently figured out what actually constituted a marriage. Peter Lombard of Paris insisted that couples needed only to exchange specific words. I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong, because there were actually two types of marriage recognition floating around, creating enough legal confusion to keep medieval lawyers busy for centuries. Secret marriages were technically prohibited, but the church recognized that people could get married without consent from parents, overlords, or even clergy. This created a legal nightmare where a promise of marriage followed by sexual intercourse was considered just as valid as a full ceremony. Suddenly, proving that consummation had actually occurred became absolutely critical. Enter the bedding ceremony, stage left, with all its public humiliation and social pressure. Here's where medieval medicine gets really fascinating, and by fascinating, I mean absolutely terrifying. Doctors in 12th century England believed women's bodies were basically ticking time bombs of instability. The dominant medical theory centered on something called uterine suffocation, or the wandering womb. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval physicians genuinely believed that a woman's uterus could wander around her body like a lost tourist, causing all sorts of problems. This wasn't some fringe theory either. The concept traced back to ancient Greece, where Plato described the uterus as an animal within an animal that roamed throughout a woman's body, blocking passages and causing disease. Aretaeus of Cappadocia called it a living thing inside a living thing, which sounds like the tagline for a horror movie nobody asked for. According to these medical experts, the wandering womb was particularly problematic for virgins, widows, and unmarried women. Their unsatisfied uteruses would produce toxic fumes and take to wandering around, causing anxiety, suffocation, tremors, convulsions, and paralysis. The treatment? Placing good smells near the vagina, bad smells near the mouth, and encouraging sneezing to coax the wayward organ back into position. medieval healthcare, everybody, where the cure was often worse than the problem. This medical understanding becomes crucial when we consider what happened during bedding ceremonies. Young brides showing signs of distress weren't seen as normal humans responding to an incredibly stressful situation. They were viewed as women whose bodies were literally malfunctioning due to their inherent female weakness. The bedding ceremony itself followed a specific ritual that would make even the most extroverted person want to hide under a rock. After the wedding feast and celebrations, the real fun began. The bride would be taken aside by the women in attendance, who would undress her, comb her hair, and offer what they cheerfully called friendly advice. Meanwhile, the men would prepare the groom, stripping him down to a dressing gown and making sure he was ready for his marital duties. Then came the grand procession to the bedchamber. The bride, now in her nightclothes, would be escorted to the bed by the female guests, while the groom received similar treatment from the men. A priest might bless the marriage bed for fertility, because apparently even God needed to get involved in this awkward situation. But wait, there's more. Once both bride and groom were in bed, the wedding party didn't just politely excuse themselves. Oh no, that would be far too considerate. Instead, they would sit on the sides of the bed and throw the couple's stockings at them. A direct hit was believed to indicate that the thrower would soon marry, turning the newlyweds into unwilling targets in a medieval game of romantic darts. Only after this charming display of public humiliation would the curtains finally be drawn around the bed, leaving the couple alone to consummate their marriage. The entire community had essentially supervised the preliminaries to what should have been the most intimate moment of their lives. Now imagine you're a teenage girl who's never met her husband before today. You've been dressed up, paraded around, negotiated over like livestock, and now dozens of people have escorted you to a bed where you're expected to perform sexually with a stranger while they make jokes and throw things at you. Your medical understanding tells you that any distress you feel is due to your inherently defective female body, and everyone around you expects you to simply endure it all with a smile. The psychological pressure was enormous. These weren't modern adults making informed decisions about their lives. Many brides were children, some as young as 12 or 13, thrust into situations they couldn't possibly understand or control. The weight of family honor, political alliances, and economic agreements rested on their shoulders, and failure wasn't an option. Medieval sources tell us about royal weddings where the pressure reached truly insane levels. Take the marriage of Margaret, daughter of Henry III, to Alexander III of Scotland. This wedding had been arranged when both children were infants, and by the time the actual ceremony took place, it represented a crucial diplomatic alliance between England and Scotland. The elaborate nature of royal weddings, with their extensive ceremonies and public scrutiny, created an environment where even the strongest individuals might become overwhelmed. Peter de Chassepot, the keeper of the king's wardrobe, and the royal tailors worked overtime to deliver all the required materials. New robes were ordered not just for the bride and groom, but for the entire royal family. Everyone was on display, and the pressure to perform perfectly was immense. The guests themselves were part of the show. Aside from celebrating the union, they were demonstrating their own wealth, status, and loyalty to the crown. The bride wasn't just getting married. She was starring in a political theatre production where every detail mattered, and every mistake would be remembered and discussed for years to come. In this environment, is it any wonder that some brides simply couldn't cope? The combination of youth, fear, unfamiliarity with their spouse, and the intensely public nature of the entire process created perfect conditions for what we would now recognize as panic attacks or acute stress reactions. But in 12th century England, a bride showing signs of distress during her bedding ceremony wasn't seen as a normal response to an abnormal situation. Instead, such episodes were interpreted through the lens of medieval medical understanding, which viewed women as inherently unstable creatures prone to various ailments. A fainting bride wasn't experiencing a panic attack. She was suffering from uterine suffocation. Her distress wasn't a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. It was evidence of her feminine weakness and medical instability. The social implications of such an episode would have been devastating. When a bride fainted publicly during her bedding ceremony, it raised questions about her health, her willingness to consummate the marriage, and potentially the validity of the union itself. The community witnesses would have been concerned about whether the marriage could be properly consummated and legally validated. This brings us to one particular incident that illustrates just how brutal this system could be. In the winter of 1170, a young English noblewoman found herself at the center of what would become one of the most talked about wedding disasters of the 12th century. Her story reveals the dark reality behind medieval marriage customs and shows us exactly what happened when the pressure became too much to bear. But before we dive into that dramatic tale, we need to understand exactly what medical treatments were available for women who fainted or showed distress during these ceremonies, and how the medieval understanding of female hysteria shaped the response to such incidents. Because what happened next would be determined not by compassion or common sense, but by the bizarre medical theories and social expectations of 12th century England. The medical response to a fainting bride would have been swift, but not necessarily helpful. Medieval physicians operated under the humoral theory, which suggested that all illness resulted from an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When a woman collapsed during her bedding ceremony, doctors would immediately assume her humors were out of whack, probably due to an excess of blood or a deficiency of heat in her system. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for almost everything, including fainting spells. Physicians would make cuts in the woman's neck or forearm, allowing blood to drain into a bowl while everyone stood around, acting like this was perfectly reasonable medical care. The theory was that removing excess blood would restore balance to her system and prevent future episodes of uterine wandering. If cutting wasn't dramatic enough, they'd bring out the leeches, those delightfully slimy, blood-sucking creatures that medieval doctors considered the height of medical sophistication. But bloodletting was just the opening act. The real show began when physicians started treating what they believed was the root cause, the wandering womb. Remember, medieval doctors genuinely thought a woman's uterus could pack up and take a vacation to other parts of her body, causing all sorts of inconvenient symptoms like fainting, breathing difficulties, and general hysteria. The treatment for this supposed uterine tourism was as bizarre as the theory itself. Physicians would place aromatic herbs and pleasant scents near the woman's genitals to attract the wayward womb back to its proper location. At the same time, they'd hold foul-smelling substances near her nose and mouth to repel the uterus from wandering upward. The medieval medical establishment had essentially turned women's bodies into a game of olfactory ping-pong, using competing smells to herd internal organs around like livestock. If smell therapy didn't work, doctors would try to provoke sneezing fits, believing that violent sneezing could physically shake the uterus back into place. They'd tickle the woman's nose with feathers, blow pepper into her nostrils, or wave pungent herbs under her face until she sneezed uncontrollably. Picture a room full of grown adults seriously attempting to sneeze someone's reproductive organs back to their proper anatomical position, and you'll start to understand why medieval medicine had such a stellar reputation. The most disturbing aspect of these treatments was that they were often performed in front of the same wedding guests who had just witnessed the bride's collapse. Privacy wasn't a concept that extended to medical care, especially when the patient was a woman whose body was considered community property through marriage. The bride's distress became a public spectacle, with physicians demonstrating their expertise, while family members and friends offered helpful suggestions about which herbs might work better or whether more leeches were needed. The social implications of a bride fainting during her bedding ceremony extended far beyond immediate medical concerns. In a society where marriages were political and economic alliances, a bride's inability to cope with the wedding night rituals raised serious questions about the validity of the entire arrangement. Family members who had negotiated the marriage would worry that their carefully planned alliance was in jeopardy. If the bride couldn't handle the stress of the bedding ceremony, how could she be trusted to fulfill her primary duty of producing heirs? Medieval society placed enormous pressure on women to prove their fertility and strengthen family bloodlines through successful pregnancies. A fainting episode during the consummation ritual could be interpreted as a sign of weakness that might affect her ability to bear children. The groom's family would be particularly concerned about whether they were getting their money's worth. Remember, they had just paid a substantial dowry for this bride, and her public collapse might suggest they'd made a poor investment. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included clauses about returning dowry payments if the bride proved unsuitable, and a dramatic fainting episode could potentially trigger such provisions. Religious authorities would also weigh in on the situation because the church had strong opinions about what constituted a valid marriage. If the bride was too distressed to participate willingly in the consummation, some clergy might argue that the marriage hadn't been properly completed. This could lead to demands for the ceremony to be repeated once the bride recovered, subjecting her to the same ordeal all over again. The political ramifications could be even more serious. If the marriage was part of a larger diplomatic arrangement between noble families or different regions, the bride's collapse might be seen as an omen of failed negotiations. Medieval people were deeply superstitious, and any disruption during important ceremonies was often interpreted as divine disapproval or a sign of future misfortune. The incident we're about to explore occurred during the winter of 1170, when Lady Matilda of Wessex found herself at the centre of what would become one of the most scandalous wedding disasters of the 12th century. Matilda was the 17-year-old daughter of a minor English lord, promised in marriage to Sir Geoffrey de Clare, a Norman knight nearly twice her age who controlled significant lands in the Welsh borderlands. The marriage had been arranged to secure her father's loyalty to the Norman establishment and provide Sir Geoffrey with an English wife who could help legitimize his control over recently conquered territories. Both families had invested heavily in the wedding preparations, seeing it as an opportunity to display their wealth and political connections to the broader noble community. The ceremony itself had proceeded normally throughout the day. Matilda had played her part perfectly during the church service, speaking her vows clearly and accepting the ring without visible distress. The wedding feast had been elaborate, featuring multiple courses, expensive wines, and entertainment from traveling musicians. Guests praised the arrangements and complimented both families on the successful alliance. But as evening approached and the time came for the bedding ceremony, something went terribly wrong. The female guests had taken Matilda to the bridal chamber, where they began the traditional process of preparing her for her wedding night. They removed her elaborate wedding gown, unpinned her hair, and dressed her in a fine linen nightgown that had been specially made for the occasion. According to witnesses, Matilda seemed increasingly agitated during this process. She began breathing rapidly. Her hands shook as the women tried to arrange her hair, and she repeatedly asked if the ceremony was really necessary. The older women tried to reassure her with the traditional friendly advice about marital duties, but their well-meaning counsel seemed to make her more nervous rather than less. When the male guests arrived with Sir Geoffrey, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The sight of her new husband, now dressed only in a linen nightgown and surrounded by laughing, wine-soaked wedding guests, seemed to trigger something in Matilda's mind. Her breathing became even more labored. She began to sway on her feet, and witnesses reported that her face turned deathly pale. The wedding party proceeded with the traditional ritual regardless of Matilda's obvious distress. They helped both bride and groom into the marriage bed, arranged the curtains, and began the customary stocking-throwing ceremony. But as the first stocking flew through the air toward the bed, Matilda let out a strangled cry and collapsed completely, falling sideways across the mattress in what appeared to be a dead faint. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some guests screamed, thinking the bride had died. Others rushed forward to check her pulse and breathing. Sir Geoffrey, finding himself alone in bed with an unconscious bride while dozens of people crowded around offering conflicting medical advice, reportedly began shouting for everyone to leave the chamber immediately. But the damage was done. Word of the bride's collapse spread through the wedding feast like wildfire, reaching every corner of the celebration within minutes. The carefully orchestrated political theatre had devolved into a medical emergency, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The physicians who were hastily summoned to treat Matilda arrived with their full arsenal of medieval medical knowledge, which unfortunately meant they were about to make the situation considerably worse. But their response, and the social chaos that followed, would reveal just how brutal the intersection of medicine, politics, and gender could be in 12th century England. What happened next would transform a private medical crisis into a public scandal that would haunt both families involved and provide a stark illustration of what happened when medieval society's expectations collided with human limitations. The treatment Matilda received, the rumors that spread about her condition, and the long-term consequences of that winter evening would show exactly why the bedding ceremony was both the most important and most dangerous moment in any medieval woman's life. The physicians arrived at Matilda's bedside, carrying their leather satchels filled with what passed for medical equipment in 12th century England. Dr. William de Montfort, the most respected physician in the region, took charge of the situation with the confidence of a man who had never doubted that women's bodies were mysterious, defective contraptions requiring constant male supervision. His first diagnosis was immediate and predictable: uterine suffocation. The wandering womb had clearly abandoned its proper position and was now wreaking havoc throughout Matilda's body. Dr. de Montfort announced this to the assembled crowd with the authority of someone stating an obvious fact, like observing that water was wet or that peasants smelled terrible. The treatment began immediately, right there in the crowded bridal chamber. Privacy wasn't even a consideration when dealing with what medieval medicine considered a routine female malfunction. Sir Geoffrey was politely asked to step aside, but the wedding guests were encouraged to stay and observe the fascinating process of correcting a wayward uterus. Dr. de Montfort's apprentices unpacked their supplies with ceremonial precision. First came the bloodletting equipment: sharp iron blades, ceramic bowls, and strips of cloth for binding wounds. The theory was straightforward enough. Excess blood was clearly causing Matilda's humors to become unbalanced, leading her uterus to wander around her body like a lost sheep. They made careful incisions on her forearms, allowing dark red blood to flow into the waiting bowls. The wedding guests watched with fascination as the physicians explained their methodology. Too little bloodletting wouldn't solve the problem, but too much might weaken the patient beyond recovery. Medieval medicine required a delicate touch when it came to draining people's life force. While the blood flowed, other preparations were underway. The physicians had brought an impressive collection of aromatic substances designed to attract the wandering uterus back to its proper location. Rose petals, lavender, sweet herbs, and expensive imported spices were arranged near Matilda's lower body, creating what looked like a bizarre medieval flower arrangement with distinctly gynecological purposes. At the same time, they prepared the foul-smelling substances that would repel the uterus from wandering upward. Rotten eggs, spoiled fish, burning sulfur, and human excrement were positioned near Matilda's head. The bridal chamber, which had been filled with the pleasant scents of wedding celebrations just minutes earlier, now reeked like a combination of flower shop and sewage pit. The contrast was so overwhelming that several wedding guests began to feel queasy themselves. Lady Margaret de Vere, Sir Geoffrey's aunt, actually vomited into a chamber pot, though she insisted it was from concern for the bride rather than the smell. The physicians noted this reaction with interest, wondering if sympathetic uterine wandering might be contagious among groups of women. Dr. de Montfort then began the most theatrical part of the treatment, attempting to sneeze Matilda's uterus back into position. His apprentices held various pungent substances under her unconscious nose, while the master physician tickled her nostrils with a goose feather. The goal was to provoke violent sneezing fits that would physically shake her internal organs back to their proper arrangement. The wedding guests watched this spectacle with the same fascination modern people might reserve for a particularly dramatic reality television show. Here was cutting-edge medical science in action, performed by educated professionals who charged substantial fees for their expertise. The fact that it involved shoving rotten fish near an unconscious bride's face while tickling her nose with bird feathers somehow seemed perfectly reasonable given the circumstances. After 20 minutes of intensive nose tickling, Matilda finally began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, she made soft groaning sounds, and her breathing became more regular. Dr. de Montfort immediately took credit for this improvement, explaining to the assembled crowd how his skilled treatment had successfully coaxed the wayward uterus back to its proper location. But Matilda's awakening only revealed the true extent of her distress. As consciousness returned, so did her awareness of the situation. She found herself lying in a bed surrounded by dozens of people, covered in her own blood from the bloodletting, with various rotting substances arranged around her body while strange men poked at her with feathers. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She began screaming, not the refined distress of a noble lady, but raw, primal terror, that cut through the chamber like a sword through silk. The sound was so piercing and desperate that several guests instinctively stepped backward, as if the noise itself might be contagious. The physicians interpreted this response as evidence that their treatment had been only partially successful. Clearly, the uterine wandering had been corrected, but now they were dealing with a case of acute hysteria brought on by the trauma of having a rogue reproductive organ loose in the patient's body cavity. Dr. de Montfort made the executive decision to increase the intensity of treatment. More bloodletting was clearly needed, along with stronger aromatic therapy and possibly some herbal sedatives to calm the patient's overwrought feminine nervous system. Medieval medicine operated on the principle that if a little bit of something didn't work, a lot more of it probably would. The second round of bloodletting was more aggressive. They opened additional veins in Matilda's neck and ankles, creating what looked like a small battlefield scene in the bridal chamber. The ceramic bowls filled with blood, while the physicians maintained their confident demeanor, explaining to the horrified wedding guests that this level of blood loss was completely normal for treating severe cases of uterine displacement. Sir Geoffrey, who had been standing quietly in the corner, watching his new wife being systematically drained of blood while surrounded by rotting fish, finally spoke up. He suggested, rather timidly, that perhaps the physicians had done enough for one evening. Maybe Lady Matilda needed rest, rather than additional medical intervention. Dr. de Montfort dismissed this suggestion with the patronizing patience reserved for laypeople who didn't understand the complexities of female anatomy. Rest was exactly the wrong approach for treating hysteria, he explained. The condition required active intervention to prevent the uterus from resuming its wandering behavior. Left untreated, uterine suffocation could progress to permanent madness or even death. The herbal sedatives came next, a mixture of poppy extract, wine, and ground beetles that was supposed to calm Matilda's overwrought nerves while preventing further episodes of organ migration. The concoction tasted as horrible as it sounded, and getting it down Matilda's throat while she continued screaming required the combined efforts of 3 apprentices and 2 female guests. The drug had an almost immediate effect. Matilda's screaming subsided to quiet whimpering, her thrashing movements became sluggish and uncoordinated, and her eyes took on the glassy, unfocused look that indicated successful medical sedation. Dr. de Montfort pronounced the treatment a complete success and began packing up his equipment with evident satisfaction. But the damage to the wedding celebration was irreversible. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated political alliance had devolved into a medical horror show that left everyone involved traumatized and confused. The guests who had come to witness a successful union instead found themselves spectators to what looked like medieval torture disguised as healthcare. Word of the incident spread beyond the immediate wedding party with the speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve. By morning, every noble household within 50 miles had heard some version of the story. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, as medieval rumors tended to do. Some versions claimed that Matilda had died and been brought back to life through the physicians' heroic efforts. Others suggested that she had been possessed by demons and required exorcism rather than medical treatment. A few particularly creative storytellers implied that the entire incident was divine punishment for some unspecified sin committed by one of the families involved. The political implications were immediate and severe. The marriage alliance that both families had worked so hard to arrange was now associated with public humiliation, medical catastrophe, and possible supernatural intervention. Other noble families began to question whether they wanted to associate themselves with people who couldn't even get through a wedding ceremony without requiring emergency medical attention. Sir Geoffrey found himself in an impossible position. He had paid a substantial dowry for a bride who had publicly collapsed during their bedding ceremony, required dramatic medical intervention, and was now the subject of scandalous gossip throughout the region. The marriage had been consummated in the technical sense. They had shared a bed, and there were witnesses, but hardly under circumstances that anyone would consider normal or auspicious. Matilda's family faced equally serious consequences. Their daughter's public breakdown reflected poorly on their bloodline and raised questions about what other hereditary weaknesses might be lurking in their family tree. Future marriage negotiations would inevitably reference this incident, making it much harder to arrange advantageous matches for Matilda's younger sisters. The church authorities were particularly concerned about the spiritual implications of the incident. Had Matilda's collapse been a sign of divine disapproval of the marriage? Was there some hidden impediment to the union that God had chosen to reveal through this dramatic intervention? These questions required careful theological consideration and possibly formal investigation, but perhaps most significantly, the incident highlighted the brutal reality of what medieval women were expected to endure in the name of family honor and political alliance. Matilda's story wasn't unique. She was simply unlucky enough to have her breakdown occur in front of witnesses who would spread the tale throughout medieval society. The aftermath of that winter evening would continue to reverberate through both families for years to come, serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of treating marriage as a business transaction and women as commodities to be negotiated over and exchanged. The bedding ceremony that was supposed to celebrate the beginning of a new life together had instead become a public demonstration of just how fragile the entire medieval social system really was when it collided with basic human limitations. What happened to Matilda in the days and weeks following her wedding night collapse would reveal even more about medieval society's approach to women who failed to conform to its impossible expectations. Her story was far from over, and the consequences of that single moment of human vulnerability would echo through her life in ways that no one present that night could have imagined. The days following Matilda's wedding night disaster unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe that nobody could stop watching. Medieval society had a peculiar talent for turning personal tragedy into public entertainment, and Matilda's story provided exactly the kind of scandalous content that kept noble households buzzing with gossip for months. Sir Geoffrey's household became a prison disguised as a manor house. Matilda spent the first week after her collapse confined to her chambers, officially recovering from her medical treatment but actually hiding from the shame that had engulfed both families. The servants whispered in corners, the visiting relatives spoke in hushed tones, and everyone pretended that having your new bride require emergency bloodletting during the bedding ceremony was perfectly normal. The physicians continued their treatments with the persistence of medieval medical professionals who never met a problem they couldn't make worse. Through creative application of leeches and herb-scented torture, Dr. de Montfort established a regular schedule of visits, appearing every few days with fresh supplies of aromatic substances and increasingly exotic theories about what might be wrong with Matilda's wandering reproductive organs. Each medical session became a performance for the household. Servants would gather outside the chamber door, listening to the sounds of treatment while placing bets on whether this session would involve more bloodletting or just the usual combination of pleasant and foul smells. The whole manor developed an unhealthy fascination with their mistress's medical condition, treating her ongoing hysteria like a recurring theatrical production. Matilda herself existed in a fog of herbal sedatives and medieval antidepressants that made everything feel distant and unreal. The poppy extracts kept her calm, but also left her struggling to form coherent thoughts or maintain conversations. When visitors came to check on her recovery, they found a young woman who seemed to be floating through her own life rather than actually living it. The religious authorities arrived in the second week, bringing their own theories about what had really happened during the bedding ceremony. Father Benedict, the regional church investigator, had seen enough dramatic wedding incidents to know that supernatural forces were usually involved when noble marriages went spectacularly wrong. His investigation began with interviews of every wedding guest who had witnessed Matilda's collapse. Each person provided a slightly different version of events, with details that grew more supernatural with each retelling. Some claimed they had seen strange shadows moving around the bridal chamber. Others insisted they had heard unearthly voices, speaking in languages that definitely weren't Latin or French. Father Benedict took detailed notes, cross-referencing the testimonies to determine whether demonic possession might explain Matilda's behavior better than simple medical hysteria. The church had extensive experience dealing with women who claimed to be afflicted by wandering wombs, and they had developed sophisticated techniques for determining when evil spirits were actually responsible for feminine misbehavior. The theological implications were serious enough to warrant consultation with higher church authorities. If demons had interfered with the wedding ceremony, the marriage itself might be invalid. This possibility sent both families into panic mode, because invalidating the marriage would mean returning the dowry and admitting that their carefully negotiated alliance had been cursed from the beginning. Meanwhile, the political consequences continued to multiply like medieval gossip on market day. Other noble families began distancing themselves from both the de Clare and Wessex households, worried that association with cursed bloodlines might bring bad luck to their own marriage negotiations. Several potential business partnerships were quietly cancelled, and invitations to important social events stopped arriving. The economic impact was immediate and brutal. Sir Geoffrey's tenants began whispering about whether their lord's cursed marriage might bring disaster to the entire estate. Crop failures, livestock diseases, and other misfortunes that would normally be attributed to bad weather or poor planning were now seen as evidence of supernatural displeasure with the de Clare household. Matilda's father found himself dealing with similar problems on his own lands. Vassals questioned whether pledging loyalty to a lord whose daughter had been publicly possessed by demons was really the best career move. The carefully constructed network of political alliances that had taken years to build began unraveling with the speed that only medieval superstition could achieve. The most devastating blow came when other noble families began questioning the mental stability of Matilda's entire bloodline. If hereditary madness ran in the family, what did that mean for future generations? The stigma of mental instability could destroy marriage prospects for decades, turning eligible daughters into unmarriageable burdens that families would struggle to support. Matilda's younger sisters found themselves suddenly transformed from valuable marriage assets into potential liabilities. Families that had previously expressed interest in marriage alliances now made polite excuses and looked elsewhere for brides who came without the baggage of public mental breakdowns and possible demonic interference. The medical establishment, never ones to admit that their treatments might be making things worse rather than better, doubled down on their approach to Matilda's condition. Dr. de Montfort consulted with colleagues from other regions, sharing detailed descriptions of her symptoms and comparing treatment methodologies. The consensus was clear. This was the most severe case of uterine wandering that anyone had encountered in recent memory. The fact that standard treatments weren't producing immediate results simply meant that more aggressive intervention was required. Medieval medicine operated on the principle that if something wasn't working, you obviously weren't doing enough of it. The enhanced treatment protocol involved daily bloodletting sessions, more potent herbal sedatives, and experimental aromatherapy techniques that pushed the boundaries of what even medieval medicine considered reasonable. Matilda's chamber began to resemble a combination hospital, laboratory, and torture chamber, with physicians testing increasingly bizarre theories about how to prevent reproductive organs from taking unauthorized tours of the human body. The constant medical intervention left Matilda in a state of perpetual semi-consciousness that made it impossible for her to participate meaningfully in her own life. She couldn't hold coherent conversations with visitors, couldn't perform the basic duties expected of a noble wife, and couldn't even maintain the pretense of normal behavior that might have helped restore her family's reputation. Sir Geoffrey found himself married to a woman who was technically alive, but functionally absent from their relationship. The political alliance that the marriage was supposed to cement had become a source of embarrassment rather than strength. His new wife required constant medical supervision, couldn't fulfill her reproductive duties, and had become the subject of regional gossip that reflected poorly on his judgment and leadership abilities. The situation created a legal nightmare that medieval courts were ill-equipped to handle. Could a marriage be considered valid if the bride had been unconscious during the consummation ceremony? Did ongoing medical treatment for hysteria constitute grounds for annulment? Were there precedents for dealing with wives whose uteruses had been definitively diagnosed as chronically nomadic? Church lawyers spent weeks researching canonical law, looking for guidance on how to handle marriages that had been consummated under medical duress. The legal questions were complicated by the fact that both families had substantial financial investments in the alliance and couldn't afford to simply walk away from their commitments. The broader noble community watched the developing crisis with the fascination that medieval people reserved for disasters that happened to other families. Matilda's story became a cautionary tale told at dinner parties, a reminder of what could happen when marriage negotiations ignored the potential for feminine mental instability. But the story also revealed something darker about medieval society's treatment of women who failed to conform to impossible expectations. Matilda hadn't chosen to collapse during her bedding ceremony. She hadn't requested the medical torture that followed. She certainly hadn't asked to become the subject of regional gossip about demonic possession and hereditary madness. Yet the entire weight of social, political, and religious consequences fell on her shoulders. Her inability to cope with an inherently traumatic situation was treated as personal failure rather than systemic cruelty. The medical and spiritual authorities who claimed to be helping her were actually making her situation worse with every intervention. The winter of 1170 stretched into spring, and Matilda's condition showed no signs of improvement. If anything, the constant medical attention was creating new problems. The regular bloodletting had left her physically weak and pale. The herbal sedatives had affected her ability to think clearly or remember recent events. The ongoing aromatherapy sessions had given her chronic headaches from exposure to various strong scents. More concerning was the psychological damage from months of being treated as a medical curiosity rather than a human being. Matilda had internalized the message that her body was fundamentally defective, and that her distress was evidence of feminine weakness rather than normal response to abnormal circumstances. The physicians, meanwhile, continued to document her case with the enthusiasm of researchers who had stumbled across a fascinating new form of pathology. Dr. de Montfort was already planning to present his findings at the next regional medical conference, where Matilda's wandering womb would become a case study for treating similar conditions in other noble wives. The irony was lost on everyone involved. The very system that had created the conditions for Matilda's breakdown was now using her suffering as evidence of why that system was necessary. Women clearly couldn't handle the responsibilities of marriage without extensive male supervision and medical intervention. The bedding ceremony was obviously essential for identifying brides who might suffer from hereditary mental instability. As spring turned towards summer, it became clear that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Both families were hemorrhaging money on medical treatments that weren't working. The political alliance was providing no benefits while continuing to generate negative publicity. Something had to change, but medieval society offered very few options for dealing with inconvenient wives who refused to recover from their feminine ailments. The solution, when it finally came, would be as brutal and pragmatic as everything else about medieval marriage. But it would also reveal the ultimate fate that awaited women who proved too fragile for the system that claimed to protect them while systematically destroying their humanity in the name of family honor and political necessity. The solution came in the form of a letter that arrived on a humid June morning, bearing the seal of Whitby Abbey. Mother Superior Margaret had heard about Matilda's condition through the extensive network of religious gossip that connected every monastery, convent, and abbey across England. Her letter was addressed to Sir Geoffrey, written in the careful Latin script that marked it as official church business. The proposal was elegantly simple and brutally practical. Whitby Abbey would accept Lady Matilda as a novice, providing her with the spiritual guidance and medical care that her condition obviously required. The church had extensive experience dealing with women whose delicate feminine constitutions couldn't handle the rigors of married life. A convent environment, with its structured routine and freedom from marital pressures, often proved therapeutic for ladies suffering from chronic uterine displacement. The financial arrangements were equally straightforward. Sir Geoffrey would make a substantial donation to the abbey, essentially paying them to take his inconvenient wife off his hands. In return, Matilda would spend the rest of her life in prayer and contemplation, safely removed from society where her mental instability couldn't cause further embarrassment to either family. The proposal solved everyone's problems except Matilda's. 12. Sir Geoffrey could claim that his wife had received a divine calling to religious service, transforming her medical catastrophe into a spiritual triumph. Her family could argue that sending their daughter to a prestigious abbey demonstrated their piety and commitment to the church. The physicians could declare their treatment successful, since removing the patient from stressful situations was clearly the logical next step in her recovery. Dr. de Montfort was particularly enthusiastic about this development. He had been running out of creative ways to treat Matilda's wandering womb, and frankly, the constant house calls were becoming expensive and time-consuming. A convent full of nuns would provide excellent opportunities to study feminine hysteria in a controlled environment, while also giving him a graceful exit from a case that had proven more challenging than anticipated. So, there you have it, the brutal reality of medieval marriage. Matilda's story wasn't unique, just unlucky enough to become public entertainment. The next time you think your wedding stress is unbearable, remember that at least nobody's planning to follow you into your bedroom with rotting fish and medical leeches. Medieval England, where love was optional, but surviving your wedding night required actual miracles.